What is up, all my dorks, nerds, geeks, and gamers? It's your host, Ghost here, and you're watching a brand new episode of Dorks in Movie Minute. We're going to continue on with our Moonknight coverage on the last two episodes, episodes 5 and 6. Episode 5, entitled Asylum, we're going to start here. Last we left off, Mark was in this afterlife where it was actually an asylum, and it seemed like a mental asylum, like the whole series was in his head. But Mark kind of knew better than that, and he knew that Ethan Hawke's character was actually manipulating him mentally. And Steven was kind of helping Mark understand that in this episode. So we start off with Mark still in the asylum. He's having an interview with Ethan Hawke's character, who is the bad guy of this, looking for Amit. And he still doesn't know how to free Amit or whatever. He's almost there, but he hasn't got it quite yet. So this episode basically deals with them, with Mark and Steven basically coming to terms with each other and basically realizing they're the same person, and the only way they're going to get out of this is if they work together to stop Ethan Hawke's bad guy in this last two episodes. But this whole episode, we're following this hippopotamus, who is kind of guiding Mark and Steven, that they have to balance the scales before the ship of the Duat gets to the end of the road, and if they don't do it before the end of the road, then they both lose and they both get trapped in the afterlife forever. Supposedly, that's what's going to happen. So, we have these two fighting off monsters, we have these two riding on the boat, just a bunch of other stuff. We also get to learn a bit more about Mark Spector and his brother, and how they had this weird relationship. The whole family did, and that's kind of like that's why his mother and father were very abusive to him and his brother, and so that's why he adopted the Mark persona to remember his brother, and that's kind of how he dealt with trauma and stress, as he kind of shut down. And he brought Steven out, who was like total optimistic. And everything else to cover for what Mark couldn't do emotionally as a character. So I really like that explanation. I really enjoyed how these two come together and how their stories play off each other really well to make one cohesive story for these two characters. We also see a third sarcophagus in the afterlife, so that assumes that third personality is there and will be somewhere in the series. I don't know if it's going to be at the last episode or if it's going to be after the last episode, but we may see the third personality of Mark Spector and Steven Grant, which is actually very cool as well, because they did tease it with that third sarcophagus that they chose not to open. But we end up getting to there's this whole thing, they're trying to balance these scales. We end up getting to the end here where Mark ends up getting knocked off the boat and ends up, not Mark, but Steven gets knocked off the boat and ends up getting like crystallized off the boat, because they say do not jump off the boat. If you jump off the boat, you're lost forever. So he ends up getting crystallized at the very end of the episode, and that's when the scales end up balancing, and Mark ends up in paradise at the end of this episode. So that's where this one ends. It's basically this whole journey about them balancing these scales on this boat. I don't want to give away all the details, but it's very action-oriented and it's very character-driven stuff that they have to go through and kind of personalize and find who they are and see how the scales balance. But eventually they do balance, and Mark ends up in paradise while Steven falls off the boat and ends up crystallized. So that one I give episode 5, Asylum. I give a 10 out of 10. I love that episode. I love the character development. I love the way that the characters interact with each other and how they're still telling a cohesive story going forward. And I still think it's a very enjoyable story, and I'm enjoying every bit of it that I'm taking in. So moving on to episode 6, this is Gods and Monsters. And this is the big MCU finale we were waiting for. So we have to deal with basically Mark, who is now in paradise. He ends up going back for Steven, and they end up agreeing that they are both equal in the body of Mark Spector. So that ends up freeing Steven from his crystallization. They end up going back to the real world, where Mark's wife is still there trying to battle Ethan Hawke's character. And at the same time, she also gets her golden scarab suit, which is actually very cool to see, because I'm glad we're getting another female character in the MCU. But I'm really happy that this is a very different type of female character, using the Egyptian lore and the characters and everything else like that. I cannot wait to see what they do with her in the actual movies in the MCU, to see if she'll be a grander member of the Avengers or something like that. But still, what a great character to see in this episode as well. But then, yeah, basically Ethan Hawke ends up getting the Amit freed. He finds Amit, he frees Amit, and Amit basically comes in and takes over all these souls, and that's what Ethan Hawke was doing this whole series, was gathering these souls for Amit before the final battle, so that when Amit comes out, he can just consume all these souls right away and become all powerful. At the same time, we have Mark and Steven trying to get Khonshu to join their side. Khonshu actually wants Mark's wife to be his vessel, but she refuses, so she ends up getting the help of another god, and that's where the golden scarab outfit comes from. And then Mark and Steven eventually do make amends with Khonshu. They basically say that if we do this, then we are your servant. Like, if you help us here, then we will be your servants forever. But then after this is done, then our servitude is done for Mark and Steven, of course. And Khonshu, being the manipulative bad guy he actually is, says yes, and he ends up taking Mark and Steven's body, making this big, there's this huge grand battle between these two gods in Egypt. It's very awesome, very cool. And they're all fighting back and forth. And people keep saying, well, people saw the Egyptian gods in the MCU, they should know they exist. Well, no, you're forgetting, when these monsters appear and these gods appear, they're completely invisible, much like the eye tentacle monster was in Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. So it's very much the same concept here, where they're completely invisible to people who does not have the magic to see them. So they didn't see anything at all. They might have seen a few dust clouds going by, maybe a few explosions out of randomness, but that's all they saw. So they did not know that these gods exist at all in the MCU. But we get this big battle. Eventually Khonshu does win, of course, that's going to happen. And he ends up beating Amet. But they don't win like a traditional way. What they basically do is just keep getting souls to Amet until it's basically too much to consume. And then Amet basically has to give up at that point. But then the day is saved, and it's the end of the series, and you think all is well, and then you think Mark and Steven are now free from Khonshu. Then we cut to after credits scene of Khonshu in the back of a limo, and we see Jake Lockley, that's his name. We see Jake Lockley, the actual third personality speaking Spanish, to Khonshu, who's like this almost pimp-like figure wearing has a cane, a white suit, looking all very dapper in this back of this limo, and he ends up getting Ethan Hawke's character killed, who was actually in an insane asylum because of after he lost Amet's power. He was just completely broken mentally, and then Jake Lockley shows up and puts a bullet in his head for Khonshu, and that's how the series ends. We don't know if we're going to get a season 2 or a series 2, or if we're going to actually see Jake Lockley bigger in the MCU, but we did finally get to see that third personality at the very end there, and I'm very happy for that we did get to see it. So I give Gods and Monsters another 10 out of 10. Love this episode as well, just as much as I love the last episode. I love the character development once again, and I also love the big giant battle of the gods in the MCU. Something different, something totally different we haven't seen in the MCU yet. Even though we have Thor, we've seen gods fight, we haven't seen them fight like this, these giant lumbering beings. So it was very cool to see Khonshu come back as well, and I'm glad he didn't die at the end of this, and I'm glad they're saving more story for him further down the line in the Moonknight story, or the Golden Scarab story, whatever one they want to go with. Bunch of great characters added into the MCU. I love Oscar Isaac as Moonknight, and I cannot wait to see if they bring him into an Avengers team as well, and I'd love to see him interact with some of the other members of the Avengers teams. But let me know down below what you guys thought of these last 2 episodes of Moonknight. Did you enjoy them as much as I did? Make sure you like, subscribe, or share, and as always guys, keep it right here on Dorks Den. I've been your host, Ghost. Adios.